Jack Mercer had been a formidable detective once, 2 decades earlier. He possessed a razor-sharp eye for detail, a quiet, steady voice that made suspects confess, and a memory that never betrayed him. That memory was now betraying him every single day. The diagnosis had arrived 6 months prior, early-onset dementia. At first, only small gaps appeared: a misplaced set of keys, a forgotten appointment with his doctor. Then the gaps widened into chasms. He could not recognize the face of his former partner. The route from the grocery store to his apartment became a foreign puzzle. Jack lived alone in a cramped apartment on the city's periphery. His only companions were a stack of yellowed case files crammed into a metal cabinet. He could no longer recall why he kept those files, only that they held immense importance. One sleepless night, he pulled out a thick folder. The name on the cover read Laura Webb. She had been 19 years old, a college student murdered on a rainy October night. That case had defined Jack's career. He had arrested a quiet janitor named Marcus Cole, a man with no alibi and an awkward demeanor. Cole was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Jack stared at the crime scene photographs. Something nagged at the back of his deteriorating mind, a detail he had either missed or deliberately ignored. His hand trembled as he turned brittle pages. He understood, with chilling certainty, that he was forgetting something vital. Something that could exonerate an innocent man or destroy whatever remained of his own shattered conscience. The Laura Webb murder had been presented as an open and shut case, or so the public and the press had been led to believe. Laura was a diligent college student last seen leaving a late-night study session at the university library. Her body was discovered 2 days later in a drainage ditch, strangled with a nylon cord. Marcus Cole worked as a janitor at that same library. His fingerprints were found on a book near where Laura had been sitting. He had no criminal history, but he was socially awkward, lived alone, and kept to himself. The prosecution painted him as a lurking predator. Jack had been the lead investigator, young and hungry for recognition. He had testified confidently at the trial. He had watched Marcus Cole be led away in handcuffs, his face blank with disbelief. Now, sitting in his dim apartment 2 decades later, Jack noticed something new in the autopsy report. The document mentioned fibers recovered from under Laura's fingernails. They were described as industrial grade and blue in color. Marcus Cole wore a gray uniform, not blue. Jack had never followed up on that fiber analysis. He had been too focused on the damning fingerprints. He checked the original evidence log. The fibers had been sent to a lab, but the results arrived 3 weeks after the trial concluded. No one had ever reviewed them. Jack's heart pounded against his ribs. He searched his failing memory for any mention of those fibers, but the details evaporated like water on hot pavement. He scribbled a note on his palm, "Check fibers." The next morning, the note was smeared and illegible. He had no idea what those words meant. He felt his own mind becoming a hostile territory. Jack decided to visit Marcus Cole in prison, a decision that required immense effort. The drive took 2 hours, and he relied entirely on a GPS device because the route had vanished from his memory. The prison was a grim concrete fortress surrounded by multiple layers of razor wire. He presented his old badge at the entrance, and after a prolonged wait, an officer escorted him to a visitation room. Marcus Cole was now 47 years old, his face deeply lined, his eyes hollow and empty. He stared at Jack without any flicker of recognition. The former detective introduced himself and explained why he had come. Marcus responded with a flat, exhausted voice, devoid of anger. He said he had been in this place for 20 years because of the man sitting across from him. Jack acknowledged this and then asked about the blue fibers. Marcus frowned, confused. He explained that he had never worn a blue uniform, all library janitors wore gray. Jack felt a cold certainty settle deep in his stomach. The fibers under Laura's nails were blue, industrial blue, the kind worn by mechanics or maintenance workers. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes widening slightly. He recalled that a maintenance crew had been repairing the library's HVAC system during the week of the murder. Those workers wore blue coveralls. Jack wrote this information in his notebook with a shaking hand. He asked for names, but Marcus could not remember any. Jack promised to investigate further. As he left the visitation room, Marcus called out that he had been innocent for 2 decades. Jack did not turn around. He was already beginning to forget the entire conversation, the details slipping away like sand through a sieve. Returning to his apartment, Jack searched frantically for the original case file. He eventually found it buried under a pile of unwashed laundry. His own mind had hidden it from him, a cruel trick of the disease. He spread the documents across the floor, covering every available surface. The lab report on the fibers was there, tucked near the back of the folder. It stated clearly that the blue polyester fibers were consistent with industrial workwear, but the origin was unknown. Jack realized he had never seen this report before. Had it been deliberately withheld by someone on the investigation team, or had he simply overlooked it in his youthful eagerness to close the case? He could no longer trust his own memory, which had become a liar. He decided to create a rigid external system. He bought a small voice recorder and a large spiral notebook. Every thought, every clue, every question would be immediately recorded in both formats. He spoke into the recorder, stating that Marcus Cole was not the real suspect, and that he needed to look for maintenance workers at the university library in October 2004. He wrote the same words in the notebook. He also added a reminder to contact his former partner, a detective named Frank Holloway. Frank had been the one who pushed for a quick arrest. Frank had dismissed the fibers as probably nothing. Frank had since retired to Florida. Jack dialed Frank's number. There was no answer, so he left a message. An hour later, he saw the phone in his hand and could not remember why he was holding it. He sat down on the floor, surrounded by papers, feeling utterly defeated. The truth was slipping away from him second by second. 3 days later, Frank Holloway returned Jack's call. The old partner sounded frail and tired, his voice thin over the phone line. Frank asked why Jack had brought up the web case after all these years. Jack struggled to remember the reason. He glanced at his notebook, which was now covered in frantic handwriting. He mentioned the blue fibers and Frank's original dismissal of them. There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the line. Then Frank spoke again, his voice careful and measured. He said he remembered those fibers, and he also remembered a maintenance worker named Danny Ross. Danny had been part of the crew working at the library that week. He had quit his job immediately after the murder and moved out of state. Jack's heart began to race. He asked why they had never investigated Danny Ross. Another silence followed, longer this time. Frank explained that the district attorney had wanted a quick arrest due to public pressure. Also, Danny had an alibi. His girlfriend claimed he had been with her on the night of the murder. Jack wrote the name Danny Ross in capital letters across a fresh page. He asked where Danny was now. Frank hesitated, then said he had heard Danny was in Nevada, working as a long-haul truck driver. Frank then expressed concern about Jack's memory. Jack ended the call abruptly. He did not want to hear any more doubts. He searched online for Danny Ross and found a man matching the description living in Reno, employed by a freight company. Jack packed a small bag. He would drive to Nevada. He wrote a large note and taped it to his front door, going to Reno. Find Danny Ross. He took his voice recorder, his notebook, and his service weapon. He did not know if he would remember the purpose of his journey by the time he reached his car. The drive to Reno took 2 full days. Jack stopped at anonymous motels along the highway, each one identical to the last. Every night, he wrote notes on the nightstand, "You are here to find Danny Ross. Laura Webb case." Each morning, he read those notes and pieced together his mission. He arrived in Reno exhausted but strangely focused. He located the freight company's depot on the outskirts of the city. He waited in the parking lot under a harsh midday sun. At noon, a heavy-set man in his 50s climbed out of a truck. He wore blue coveralls, the exact same shade of blue described in the lab report from 20 years ago. His face was weathered and lined. Jack approached him and asked if he was Danny Ross. The man looked up, wary and defensive, and asked who was asking. Jack showed his old badge and explained that he was a retired detective who wanted to talk about the Laura Webb murder. The man's face went pale instantly. He took a step back and denied knowing anything about the case. But Jack noticed the man's hands were shaking. He mentioned the maintenance crew and the blue coveralls. Danny tried to laugh it off as a coincidence, claiming he had never killed anyone. Jack stared at him without blinking. For a terrifying moment, his memory flickered and died. He could not remember why he was standing in a parking lot in Nevada. He looked at his hand, where he had written the words, Danny. Fibers. Confession. The world steadied. Jack said quietly that he believed Danny was the killer and that he had been hiding for 20 years. Danny did not deny it. He simply suggested they go to a diner down the street to talk. Danny Ross led Jack to a small diner with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee. Jack understood this was a tactic, a way for Danny to control the environment, but he followed anyway. Over 2 cups of lukewarm coffee, Danny began to talk. He had been 28 years old at the time of the murder, recently divorced, and working a series of odd jobs. He had seen Laura Webb in the library parking lot late at night. She was alone. Something inside him had snapped, though he never used the word murder. He said he had lost control. Jack listened intently, his hidden voice recorder running. Danny did not know he was being recorded. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, describing in detail how he had followed Laura, how he had grabbed her from behind, how he had strangled her with a nylon cord. He described the blue fibers she had scratched from his coveralls during the struggle. He even described how he had planted Marcus Cole's fingerprint on a book near Laura's body. He had stolen a book that Marcus had touched earlier that day. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He asked Danny why he was confessing after all these years. Danny shrugged and replied that Jack was an old man with dementia, and no one would believe him anyway. Danny said he was tired of being afraid for 2 decades. Jack finished his coffee and looked at his voice recorder. The battery was running low. He pressed the stop and save buttons carefully. Then he looked directly at Danny and told him he was wrong about one thing. Jack might forget, but the recording would not. He stood up and walked out of the diner without looking back. Jack drove directly to the local police department in Reno, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He asked to speak with a detective. The officer at the front desk looked skeptical, his eyes scanning Jack's disheveled appearance. Jack explained the Laura Webb case and the wrongful conviction of Marcus Cole. He mentioned his own dementia diagnosis. The officer's expression soured. Jack then pulled out his voice recorder, confident that the confession was safe. He pressed play. Nothing happened. The battery was completely dead. The recording had not saved because the save button required a long press that Jack had forgotten to perform. His heart stopped. He stood there, holding a useless device, his face burning with humiliation. The officer shook his head and suggested that Jack should go home and rest. Jack left the station, defeated and hollow. He sat in his car, staring at the dashboard. He had lost the only piece of hard evidence. But then he remembered his notebook. He flipped through the pages frantically. He had written down key phrases from Danny's confession, not verbatim but enough to reconstruct the narrative. He also remembered a specific detail Danny had mentioned, the location of Laura's missing earring. Danny had kept it as a souvenir and buried it behind the library, under a large oak tree. Jack started the car engine. He would not return to the police again until he had physical proof. He drove back toward his home state, toward the university library. He had a partial confession in his notebook and a memory that was fading by the hour. He wrote on his forearm in bold letters, "Dig under oak tree." Jack arrived at the university library at dawn, the sky still gray and cold. The building had changed over 20 years, with new wings added and old ones renovated, but the large oak tree remained, its gnarled branches spreading wide. He parked his car and walked to the tree, carrying a small shovel he had kept in his trunk for emergencies. The ground was soft from recent rain. He began to dig, each shovelful of earth requiring more effort than the last. After 10 minutes, his back ached terribly. After 20 minutes, his hands were blistered and bleeding. He was about to give up when the shovel struck something hard. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt with his fingers. A small plastic bag, yellowed and brittle with age, emerged from the soil. Inside was a silver earring, tarnished but unmistakable. It was Laura Webb's earring, the one never found at the original crime scene. Jack held it in his trembling hands. Tears filled his eyes. He had the proof he needed. But then a wave of profound confusion washed over him. Where was he? Why was he holding a dirty plastic bag? He looked around, disoriented. The sun was rising over an unfamiliar building. He saw a shovel in his hand and a hole in the ground. His memory had reset completely. He sat down against the trunk of the oak tree, clutching the earring. He did not remember Laura Webb. He did not remember Danny Ross. He did not remember the 20-year-old case. He only knew that this small object was important. He looked at his forearm and read the words, "Dig under oak tree." He did not understand why he had written them. He put the earring in his pocket and walked back to his car. He sat there for an hour, waiting for the fog to lift. It did not. By noon, a fragment of memory returned to Jack. He saw the name Danny Ross in his notebook, written in large capital letters. He read the partial confession he had transcribed. The earring in his pocket confirmed the story. He drove back to the Reno police station, this time insisting on speaking with a specific detective he had researched earlier, Sarah Chen, a young but respected investigator known for listening to unusual cases. Jack sat in her small office and laid everything out on her desk, the original case file, the fiber report, his notebook filled with frantic notes, and the plastic bag containing the earring. He told her about Danny Ross and the diner confession. He played a new recording he had made that morning, summarizing what Danny had said. Detective Chen listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Jack finished, she asked a difficult question. She pointed out that Jack had dementia and that his memory was unreliable. Why should she believe him? Jack pointed to the earring. He explained that it belonged to Laura Webb and had never been entered into evidence. Only the killer could have buried it. He suggested that she run DNA tests on the sweat and skin cells inside the plastic bag. Those tests would reveal Danny Ross. Detective Chen picked up the earring with gloved hands. She looked at Jack for a long moment. Then she nodded. She said she would open a formal investigation, but she warned that the process could take months. She also expressed concern about Jack's deteriorating condition. Jack smiled sadly. He said he might not remember any of this tomorrow, but that did not matter. What mattered was that Marcus Cole went free. He stood up, shook her hand formally, and walked out of the station without another word. 6 weeks passed. Jack's memory deteriorated at an accelerating pace. He forgot to eat on some days. He forgot to pay his bills, and his electricity was nearly shut off. But he never forgot the name Laura Webb. That name was written on every surface of his apartment, the walls, the bathroom mirror, the refrigerator door, even the ceiling above his bed. He had trained himself to look at those notes each morning, a desperate ritual to anchor himself to reality. One afternoon, Detective Chen visited his apartment. She found him sitting in his chair, staring at a blank wall. She sat across from him and delivered the news. The DNA test on the plastic bag had yielded a match. Danny Ross's sweat and skin cells were inside. He had been arrested the previous day and had confessed again, this time on video, with a lawyer present. Marcus Cole was being released from prison the following week. Detective Chen told Jack that he had done it. He had solved the case. Jack stared at her, struggling to place her face. He asked who she was. She smiled gently and explained that she was the detective who had helped him solve the Laura Webb case. She reminded him that Marcus Cole was innocent and would soon be free. Jack nodded, not fully comprehending, but something warm spread through his chest. He looked down at his hands, which were old and spotted with age. He had spent his last good months on this mission. And he had won. Detective Chen left shortly after. Jack sat in his chair, holding his voice recorder. He played the last message he had recorded for himself, his own voice instructing him that he had solved the case and done the right thing. He set the recorder down and watched the sunset through the window. The release of Marcus Cole from prison was a deliberately quiet event. No news cameras gathered outside the gates. No reporters shouted questions. Marcus walked out alone, wearing civilian clothes that were 2 decades out of style. Jack was not invited to witness the release. He would not have remembered to attend even if he had been invited. But Detective Chen visited Jack the following day. She brought a handwritten letter. Marcus had written it from a halfway house, his penmanship careful and deliberate. The letter thanked Jack for giving him back his life. Marcus wrote that he did not blame the detective for the past. Jack had been a good detective who made an honest mistake, but he had also been a good man who fixed that mistake when it mattered most. Marcus hoped that Jack would find peace. Jack read the letter 3 times, each time forgetting the previous reading within minutes. Finally, he folded the paper and placed it under his pillow. He did not know who Marcus Cole was, but the name felt important, like a key to a lock he could no longer see. Detective Chen also informed Jack that the state would not pursue any charges against him for the wrongful conviction. The district attorney's office had concluded that Jack had acted in good faith, and his recent work had corrected the error. But Jack's legacy was complicated. Some would call him a hero. Others would call him a warning. Jack did not care about any of this. He could no longer hold on to opinions for more than a few minutes. He spent his days in his chair, watching the light change through the window, the names Laura and Marcus fading in and out of his consciousness like distant stars. 6 months later, Jack Mercer died in his sleep. He was 63 years old. The apartment was nearly empty, containing only the metal cabinet of case files, a few pieces of furniture, and the voice recorder on his nightstand. Detective Sarah Chen came to collect his personal effects. She found the recorder and noticed that the battery was dead. She plugged it into a charger and pressed play. The last recording was dated the night before Jack died. His voice was slow, uncertain, and fragile, but still clear. He said that he did not remember who he was or where he lived. He did not remember his own name. But he remembered Laura Webb. He remembered that he had fixed something broken. He said that was enough. Chen turned off the recorder and sat in the quiet room. Outside the window, the city continued its relentless motion. The Laura Webb case was now officially closed. Marcus Cole was free, living a quiet and anonymous life in another state, trying to rebuild what had been stolen from him. Danny Ross was in a maximum security prison, finally facing justice for a murder he had confessed to twice. And Jack Mercer, the detective who lost his mind but found his conscience in the process, was gone. There was no funeral. No newspaper headlines. No public recognition. But in the sealed records of the police department, a permanent note was added to the original case file. It stated that the case had been reopened and solved by retired Detective Jack Mercer, and that his work had posthumously exonerated Marcus Cole. That was his legacy. Not perfect, but true. And for a man who could not hold on to anything else, not even his own reflection, the truth was finally, irrevocably enough.